Hi everyone, it's Paula MacLean again, and I'm back. This time we're going to be talking about board meetings and how to manage board meetings effectively, and also about committee meetings and committee meeting structure. So let's start off with how do we get to having a really good board meeting. Well, it actually starts about 2 weeks in advance of the meeting. An email should go out from the chair. Sometimes it goes from the ED, but I'm going to really reinforce the idea that the ED should not be setting the board's agenda for the board meetings. This should be done by the chair with the support of the executive director. So the chair would send out an email to all the members of the board and say, what are some of the agenda items that you would like to see on the board agenda for 2 weeks from now? Now, don't be surprised if you don't get a ton of responses. When we talk about board engagement, we've really talked lots about how do we encourage board members to participate in. Let me tell you, it starts with building your agenda. Many boards have been taught to be passive. The executive director often builds the agenda, which is, in my opinion, not a good idea. It's okay to have input into it. It's certainly good that the executive director supports that process. But we start off by teaching board members to be passive by not asking them, what do you think we should be talking about at board meetings? And so inviting board members to bring things forward, to have an agenda item that they would speak to, is a really important part of this. And as time goes on, you'll begin to get some responses to your emails going out. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the chair and the executive director sit down and begin to structure the agenda. The beginning end of the agenda usually allows for introduction of any guests, approval of the previous meeting minutes, business arising from the minutes. So those are kind of formulaic in your agenda, and you can template them if you would like. But you want to bring forward anything that might have come from your board members, and then you begin the process of putting the things that are important first. Now, let me tell you, very often if we put things important first, it becomes important to be on time for the meeting. So if the biggest, most important issue of the day is actually on your agenda first, rather than burying it, 2, 3, 4 agenda meeting items down, your meeting starts off where you really have your best energy. Whether you meet during the day or whether you meet in the late afternoon or evening, our energy is always best at the beginning. And boards who create a habit of starting meetings on time and starting it with the most important agenda item really encourage people to be there on time, be focused, and use the best energy right off the bat. So that's a really important part of setting the priorities of the agenda. If you've got a tough item, if you've got a really exciting item that needs a decision, needs some discussion, needs some focus, put it first. And then we distribute the agenda and the board meeting package, and I really like to not kill a lot of trees. If the only way you can get things to people are in paper version, that's perfectly fine. But I really prefer an agenda and board package that is electronic. And increasingly, we see board members bringing their electronic devices to the board meeting table, and rather than printing everything at home or at work before the meeting, they're actually bringing their board package in electronic form on a tablet, on a laptop, or even in some cases, I was in a meeting a couple of weeks ago where everybody had everything, including a draft that we were working with of a multi-page document, had it on their phones. I find that very difficult to read and very difficult to kind of focus and concentrate on, but whatever works, that's great. So, as time goes on, we get more adept at using technology. Pretty a good idea to make things electronic wherever we can. Then that should go out 5 days ahead of time so that board members are kind of ready and have an ample opportunity to fit the reading of materials in the board package into their work day, home day, whatever it might be. What we do need is also a day or so, sometimes 2 days ahead of time, an email or a phone call reminder, usually from admin support staff inside the organization, sometimes from the ED, sometimes from a board volunteer, depending on the size of your organization and what you prefer. A reminder goes out to each one of the board members and of the date, time, and place. Now, lots of times the time and place is known because it's standardized. By the way, I would really encourage you to set a year's worth of board meeting dates in advance. You can change them or tweak them if you need to, but this whole idea of setting board meeting dates in advance really gives people an opportunity to predict their schedule, know when they shouldn't take an evening meeting for their work because they have an evening meeting for your nonprofit. So those kinds of things are really helpful to board members for staying organized and staying ahead of the game. I would really encourage you then to discipline your board members to making sure that they are maintaining their own schedule. If they have it a year or so in advance or even 10 months in advance is really helpful. So one of the things I would like you to consider is using what we call a consent agenda. A consent agenda is exactly what it sounds like. It's a grouping of items that the board consents to approve as a routine matter, and it is approved by one motion. So it will be motion to approve the consent agenda, and it's any items that are absolutely routine that the board is accustomed to seeing, doesn't need to review, doesn't need to look at. And the practice here is that if any member looks at the consent agenda, which is usually a group of agenda items at the very top of your written agenda, is if any board member looks at that collection of items and says, Madam Chair, I would really like to have a separate discussion about this item, without question, without debate or discussion, that item automatically moves onto your regular agenda. So it falls off the consent agenda, and you approve what is left of the consent agenda, and the member that questioned any item, and again, do not say, oh gee, I think we can prove that with the consent agenda. If it's questioned, if it's asked about, it immediately moves to a regular agenda item, usually the next thing on the agenda. You can move it up or down depending on what the item actually is. So this is a way of being efficient. This moves things along, so you're getting your consent agenda dealt with very quickly in your board meeting, and then what you're doing is moving to the more important items. So we get rid of the routine kinds of items. Among those, by the way, can be any kinds of operational reports, any kinds of updates on any kind of routine items. I've seen boards that have routine reporting by various committees, and those are actually approved in the consent agenda. I have a little bit of discomfort with that because I think we should be having a higher level of engagement with our committees, and board members actually should be reading, and we should be discussing the work that's coming from committees. If you have committees that are in hiatus and they are reactivated at certain points in time, nominating committee is a good example of that. So if it's not actively working, there may be no report from nominating committee, and then you can just drop it off the agenda completely, and the committee only reports when it's active and when there's something to actually report. So the thing that we need to understand with consent agendas is they're convenient and they move things along, but they also can be a little bit risky. What we don't want to do is end up with anything on the consent agenda that potentially has impact or is information the board really does need to talk about or think about. So I would caution you that what you need to do is to use the consent agenda relatively carefully and make sure you don't end up with stuff on that that's getting glossed over. So agenda items can also be coded. Now they can be timed as well, and I'll talk with you a little bit about what I think about that idea. The coding I really like, and so we can, behind each agenda item, clarify what is this agenda item all about. And I've given you just 3 examples of codes. You can use these, you can make up ones that make better sense for you, it doesn't really matter. So we take an agenda item and then we code it as for information only, which means there's no discussion necessary. It's just simply, here it is, and that could be the fundraising dinner has been confirmed, and it's set for March the 7th, and that's it. So there's no conversation needed, there's no debate, there's no motion, there's nothing. So this moves our board meeting along quite efficiently. Another code that you can use is FDO, which is for discussion, but it's for discussion only, meaning there's no decision that's needed, there's no expectation that we have to decide anything. So these can be applied to agenda items that are in the early stages of the conversation, something perhaps that's come forward from a committee where it needs the board's attention decision, where we need to have a conversation about it, but there's not a decision either needed or not a decision needed yet. So this can be one of those that are kind of a developing agenda item over a period of months or even years. Another code you can use is FDM, which means for discussion and motion, which means we are actually making a decision about this. This really helps us understand what's the objective of a particular agenda item. Are we just supposed to take this in? Are we supposed to have a conversation about it but don't have to make a decision? Or are we actually having a conversation about it and having a motion? So you can use whatever coding is important to you, but this really helps us understand what we're talking about with each item. Now, timing agenda items I have a very love-hate relationship with. The intention of timing is a good one. If we say 5 minutes on this item, it says, let's not spend 15 minutes on something that's only worth 5. The problem is sometimes, and even as an executive director and as a former board leader, sometimes when we look at the agenda, we think, oh, that's just a 5-minute item. And in fact, once the board looks at it, or based on some input from one or more members, you find out, well, this is a little deeper than 5 minutes, and we end up spending 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes on it, and that may be really valuable and needed time. So I'm a little bit cautious about putting times on things, because if we start taking a 5-minute item that on the agenda shows as 5 minutes and spending 20 minutes on it, that's very much needed, we can get people starting to be kind of anxious. You can get members saying to the chair, Madam Chair, we're behind, like we're 20 minutes over on this particular item. And that might have been 20 minutes of wasted time, but it very often is 20 minutes of very well used time. So think about how we are time limiting, and there's, you know, the setting of times on an agenda is a guess. So it should be used as a guide. It's a little bit of a crapshoot, and don't want to rush conversations that need to be a little bit longer than perhaps we anticipated when they built the actual agenda. All right, let's move to then the day of the board meeting. By the way, the executive directors that are watching this video, the vast majority of executive directors essentially clear their calendar and do very little else other than prepare for the board meeting the day of the board meeting. At least if you're having an late afternoon or evening meeting, you're going to clear your afternoon. The board meeting days have a habit of having little issues popping up. That can be a quorum issue, it can be an agenda item issue, it can be a preparation issue of, do we have the stuff ready? Are we ready for the conversation? Have we reviewed the financials? Are we expecting questions or comments on the financials? So there can be any of a number of things for either staff or board members that are coming forward. There's often last minute agenda items, and those inevitably don't usually come to the chair, they come to the executive director. So it is commonplace for most executive directors to keep a relatively clear calendar for the day of the board meeting. Usually a quick phone call, often initiated by the executive director to the chair of the board, midday if you're having a late afternoon or evening meeting, that just says we're good to go, or I've picked this or that, we've added an agenda item, whatever the changes are that are kind of last minute. It's better to do it in a quick phone call during the day than it is to try and grab the chair right before the meeting starts and kind of jam that communication into that. If that's the best you can do because people are busy, then that's perfectly fine. But I really prefer just a quick phone call to say we're good to go, we've added an agenda item, whatever the changes might be. I really love the idea of having 30 minutes of social time before every single board meeting. Now, if you meet at noon or early morning, it's probably not feasible, but the vast majority of board meetings are either on a Saturday, they're on a weekday, late afternoon or early evening. And I like the idea of sharing food, you know, having a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, glass of water together, chatting, getting to know each other. This is really helpful for new board members who are just coming into the organization, and it adds faces to names. It lets us update each other in terms of our personal lives, and it really does kind of ease us into the work of the board in a fairly friendly and kind of upbeat kind of way. What is important is that the chair then 5 minutes before that 30 minutes is done, give a 5-minute notice. Just, you know, the lights are going down, right? Just saying, here we are, we're ready to have our meeting start. So a 5-minute warning from the chair that we're about to call the meeting to order. And that's a way of saying, you know, refill your coffee, get a quick bathroom break in, whatever you need to do to take care of your own comfort, you've got 5 minutes to do it. Bring your meeting to a start very cleanly, say I'm calling the meeting to order, and do it on time every time, regardless of who is in the room. Do not wait for Mary, Frank, Sue, or Katrina. Don't do it. We want to create a meeting that has a discipline that says this is one board who starts their meetings on time. If you feel a little bit as a chair of being, the adjutant general, that's fine, because this is something that good chairs do. They do it consistently, and it creates a culture that says the board meeting starts on time. If you're late, you're late. We expect and understand that you have home lives and working lives that will periodically happen, but discipline yourself to a culture that says stuff starts on time. And by the way, try to end on time, and the vast majority of board meetings tend to end on time, but they don't tend to start on time. When you call the meeting to order, there should be some check of quorum. Now, quorum is usually half of the number of people who are elected to your board. Check your bylaws or your governance policies on this, but there needs to be a check of quorum to say, yes, we have quorum. The chair can just simply declare that. Any board member can indicate to the chair, and they can say, Madam Chair, I confirm that there's quorum. It doesn't matter who does it or how it's done. It should be noted in the minutes. If you don't have quorum, note that in the minutes, but that can change 5 minutes from now when one or two members who are late walk through the door. So a quick note in the minutes that the meeting was opened and called to order without quorum, and then when two more board members or one more board member comes in the door and you then have quorum, the recording secretary should simply indicate at 6:05 Mary arrived and it was confirmed that we have quorum on at tonight's board meeting. So that is very clear, important thing, because here's the deal. If you make motions and you don't have quorum, they can be challenged or questioned. I'm going to give you 2 ways of managing that when we don't have quorum. My encouragement to you is, if you don't have quorum at the beginning of the meeting, continue on. There's nothing more frustrating for the people that made it out to the meeting, who put other things in their lives on hold, to be there for that meeting, to be told we don't have quorum, the meeting is adjourned and we can't meet. It's not true that you can't meet. You need to watch how you are making decisions when you don't have quorum. So what I would encourage you to do is simply go business as usual. We're going to continue our meeting. We're aware that we don't have quorum, and when you get to an actual motion that you need to make, you have some choices. So very important that we then not stop meeting processes just because of quorum. We need to think about, what do we want to do? Now, there's 2 choices that you have. Not make motions and hold the decisions that you need over until your next meeting, where hopefully you will have quorum. That's one option. So essentially it's saying we're kind of hamstrung, we can't make decisions as in motions that are seconded and voted upon. The second option is the one, however, that I prefer, and that is you make and pass motions as you normally would, and then you subject those motions to ratification at the next board meeting. Now, the only caution we have to exercise here is to make sure that if we have motions without quorum and their routine items were fine, if they're approval of the minutes, if they're approval of a new agenda item, any of those kinds of things, any routine, accept the executive director's report, approve the financial statements, any of those things are pretty routine. However, if we have a crucial item, if we're voting on a $500,000 land purchase, or if we're voting on a loan, any of those kinds of things that have really application critical kinds of potential upstream impact, pretty important that we hold back on those major motions and hold them over. You can always hold a telephone meeting and vote by telephone. You can have your bylaws and your governance policies should give you a number of different choices for how you might manage that. So quorum should not having quorum should not hamstring you. The better approach is obviously to always have quorum. You should know going into a meeting if you're not going to have quorum, because you've made your reminder phone calls, and hopefully people who are unable to attend have let you know. All right, so we're at the beginning of our agenda. We may have passed our consent agenda already, or we might have pushed the consent agenda down one item, and then we can request any agenda items that are additional that haven't come forward in the day or week prior to to the meeting. Then we move approval of the minutes from the last meeting. We ask for any errors of omissions on those minutes. If there are any, we make those corrections, and then we pass the minutes as revised or as corrected. So with those noted corrections, we first, second, and vote on the completion of the minutes from the previous meeting. This is, again, pretty standard business meeting kind of protocol, and most people do it pretty well. Now then, we ask for any discussion items from any business arising from those minutes that's not already on the agenda. And if the chair and the executive director have done their job well, those items should, for discussion, if they're major items, should appear on the agenda further down the agenda, and we don't need to then talk about them as business arising. If they're short items, just points of information, updates, that kind of thing, business arising from the minutes is usually a fairly short kind of portion to your agenda. So then normally what's up next is your consent agenda, and we'll move, second, and approve the consent agenda items as a bundle, as a batch. Now, when we keep meetings progressing, we want to make sure we're not rushing conversations. I've worked in many organizations, and it's a delicate balance for the chair to know when enough conversation is enough, but also to not push so hard that we end up with stuff going, kind of being swept under the carpet and not having a proper conversation. Board engagement is a very delicate thing. More conversation usually improves board engagement. So if you were to err as a chairperson, as an executive director, it's better to have more conversation rather than less. And I'm going to remind the executive directors watching this video is that do not dominate your board meetings. The best executive directors let their boards work. They let the conversation come from board members and be about the board members' thoughts, ideas, concerns, issues with anything that is on the agenda. So while you can certainly respond and reply and answer questions, it's a really good measure of the success of your board and the level of engagement on the board of who's doing what percentage of talking. And it's one of the little barometers that I use when I'm sitting in as a guest in board meetings. I watch how much conversation is coming from staff and how much conversation is coming from board members. And it's a really good measure of board engagement that it's the board who's actually doing the work and the executive director is being responsive, helpful, supportive, answering questions, etc. Now, one of our things that we talked about when we talked about the fingers in and arms around concept of governance and operations is that we want one board member, and this can change from meeting to meeting, or it can be one board member at all meetings, the same board member at all meetings. We want one board member to be the monitor of, is this an arms around or fingers in conversation? Now, the thing is that the agenda item itself may in fact be governance related, but one of the things that happens is we have a little drift in the conversation. So we start off with a governance agenda item and we're fine, and then the conversation begins to wander into operations. We need a gatekeeper, one board member who's charged and vigilant, charged with responsibility, and is vigilant. The whole idea of, is this becoming a fingers in conversation? And as soon as it is, that person has the board's permission and it has the chair's ear to be able to catch something before it drifts too far. So bring us back. Yes, that's right. We're having a little bit more of a operational conversation right now. Let's bring us back to the governance issue, which is where we started off the conversation. One of the important things to remember is that the chair has the authority, and the board members should respect the chair's authority to draw any conversation, any discussion to a close. So at the point that the chair feels that the board has heard as many different perspectives and perhaps as needed, and then perhaps we're beginning to cycle back and repeat ourselves, or hearing from the same people with the same points over and over again, the chair has the responsibility and permission and authority to draw that to a close and call the question. And what we mean by call the question is call for a vote of the members. So what's important here is that we understand the order of things. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in the next lesson. But the order is, we have a motion, if this is a for discussion and motion, an FDM, is that we have a motion, a seconder, and then the conversation. When the conversation has drawn to a close, the motion is already on the table and the chair simply asks for it to be reread and you vote on it. So that's the end of this lesson. Please continue on to the next lesson.